Well, it seems like old Vlad at Generation Iron's got his fangs into bodybuilding legend Robby Robinson in a new documentary titled The Blueprint. It's a title which possibly plays off the name recognition of another self-proclaimed blueprint from that other vampire in the fitness world, tech mogul Brian Johnson and his quest for eternal youth. But where Johnson throws millions at dubious life extension schemes using some of the most miserable, expensive and soul-depleting means available, the Black Prince, Robby Robinson, aka Mr. Lifestyle, promises a more grounded approach to longevity. As it currently stands, 77-year-old Robby is a bodybuilding anomaly, and in a league of his own in that he A, still has a better physique that would make most guys half his age envious, and B, he's achieved it in a sport that has many guys expediting their own trip to that big gym in the sky through their own reckless commitment to chemically assisted protracted suicide. To top it off, in over 50 years of training, Robby's never had an injury or surgery, which is almost unheard of in this game, and it speaks to how Robinson stands as an aspirational template for bodybuilding done right, at least in the training and nutritional sense. And credit where it's due, you got to be impressed at Robinson's dedication to health and bodybuilding. In an era where the biggest guy wins seems to be the prevailing imperative, Robinson's focus on longevity and overall health is pretty refreshing. Robby's undoubtedly inspired and influenced a whole generation of bodybuilders. Guys like Tony Pearson, Tom Platz, and even Dorian Yates have cited Robby's effect on their own lives. And when I saw Robby's physique in Pumping Iron, I remember thinking, I want to see a documentary about that guy. So needless to say, I was pretty pumped for this film. However, given that Generation Iron are pretty much the Disney Lucasfilm equivalent when it comes to bodybuilding documentaries, the prognosis of these guys skillfully handling Robby's story was never one filled with optimism in the first place. I thought we'd get a deep dive into Robby's life story and legacy, but instead from the outset we get this bizarre insertion of a guy called Tim Taylor, who's a middle-aged business guy looking to shape up by becoming Robby's protege, learning his secrets, and organising them into a 6-step blueprint for others to follow. I think more than anything, Tim probably put the money up for this film, so rather than going deep into Robby's own story, we get this constant shift in focus on the insertion of Tim Taylor and his transformation. It's a frustrating narrative framing because it barely scratches the surface of Robinson's own story, and if you've read his autobiography, The Black Prince, you know that there's a ton of material that they could have covered, but instead we get these loosely connected snippets that don't really go anywhere. The film does show how Robby is still incredibly committed to bodybuilding, even as the sport's changed around him. It touches on some complex and controversial stuff too. Over the years, Robby's positioned himself as the iconoclastic rebel, railing against the injustices of societal racism and the Weider hierarchy, so that in this it's become a well-rehearsed and rehashed soundbite by now. Robby maintains that his outspokenness did him no favours and ultimately prevented him from scaling his deserved true heights of bodybuilding stardom. He also contends that he was ultimately banned for life for making negative statements about Weider supplements, saying that neither he nor any of the other guys used them. He also trots out that by now well-worn tale of Weider's mantra that black guys on covers didn't sell magazines, while ignoring the fact that he was on any number of covers, along with other numerous black champions. And despite his so-called ban from the sport, Robby was also invited to return to the IFBB's inaugural Mr. Olympia competition in 1994. You know, the one cooked up and created for a newly returned Lou Ferrigno to win. So if there's so much racism and fixed competition, how does Robby reconcile his own victory with all that supposed Weider bias against him? And how does he also level with the fact that the winningest Mr. Olympias in the history of the sport are both black? Although the other black champions from the era had Weider contracts, and those coming up in the 80s and 90s spoke nothing about this so-called racism, either then or retroactively when it's now become a fashionable talking point to do so.
So Robby Robinson basically said that he met Joe Weider in the 70s, 75 or whatever, and he basically said that he experienced a lot of racism from Joe Weider, from unequal pay and all this stuff, you know, in the 70s and I guess 80s. I want to get your opinion on this and see if there's any truth to that and if you ever experienced something like that, you know, around Joe Weider or anybody else. Just want to get your opinion on that.
Never in my entire life have I ever experienced any of that from Weider or the Weider office or Weider publications. Never.
you up on the inside. I don't pretend to know what all is going on in Robby Robinson's head, being a military vet, growing up black in the South, and being 74 years old and still feeling like he didn't get the...
Is it just old sour grape, Sean?
Listen, there's nothing more racist than an old black man. I can tell you that.
And yes, Weider infamously used Robby's torso as the logo for the Weider bust, minus any permission or compensation. But one thing is clear, that bodybuilding is littered with the corpses of bad judging and politically and business-motivated decisions. Many guys besides Robinson were screwed over regardless of their skin colour. Weider was, at the end of the day, a rapacious businessman, more than an avowed racist. But the bodybuilders of that era also refused to collectively unionise against him due to their own fragile egos, and selfishly jockeying for position within the hierarchy. Some comments definitely come across as Robby holding a victim mentality, to the point it's become his own long-held personal cross to bear. A chip on his shoulder, and a seeming justification for every negative thing that's ever happened to him in his life. I remember reading in a Flex magazine years ago that Robby had been drafted into the Vietnam War, and that his platoon was wiped out in an ambush. Robby had hid under the body of a fallen comrade, and was then bayoneted in the leg by a VC soldier while Robby played dead. I had searched for years for something about this, to the point that I thought that maybe I had just hallucinated the whole story. The only thing I could find on Robby's Vietnam service in the interim was a diary sold on Amazon by a Robby Robinson, who was a real-life war hero who saved his platoon with his own selfless sacrifice by taking out a machine gun nest. The documentary also makes allusions to Robby's Vietnam service. But I've also since heard Robby clear up the entire real backstory recently on a channel called Space, who's conducted a series of really in-depth interviews with Robby. Space's production gives way more insight into Robby than this documentary, so I definitely recommend checking out his channel and his excellent interviews. Anyway, it turns out that according to Robby, Weider's publications made the whole thing up just for juicy content. I mean, who would have guessed? But for what I don't understand is why Robby never set the record straight in the first place by clearing up these misconceptions much earlier.
Preparing myself to go to Vietnam. But in the retirement of all that, fate sent me to the Dominican Republic, which pretty much saved my life in a sense. Saved my life, because I wasn't ready to give up a life that I haven't even lived yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
And fate came in there. That's what I say, if you believe in something hard enough, I really do not want to end up like that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting that he dined out on these stories for years after or anything, but there's certainly a lot of websites and publications who cite Robby as being a Vietnam vet. So it's a pretty big deal to ignore something that comes off as stolen valor, misrepresentation or not. In both the documentary and the Dorian Yates podcast, Robby danced around the topic when asked directly about his Vietnam War service, which not only alludes to said service, but neither does Robby take the opportunity to again set the record straight. And if you listen closely to his words, it straight up sounds like that Robby served in Vietnam.
You're a veteran, right? You're in Vietnam. You happy to talk about that a little bit? When was that?
What happened is, during those days, you were talking about going during the Vietnam War. I was drafted right out of high school. I had to go to serve the army for 2 years. During this time, I'm thinking like, wow, we have to, this is a war going on. So they were shipping everybody out. You finish basic training, advanced instrument training. I went to jump school. You go to jump school. And from that point on, they prepared you to send you to Vietnam.
And how old were you, Robby? What age was that?
During that crisis with the Vietnam thing, we were all prepared. They sent us all to Dominican Republic to create and do war games, to prepare to go to Vietnam. And we were all shipped out, shipped over. And then it seemed like all of a sudden it became a conflict, and everything was now starting to just be normal again. They were trying to de-escalate the war.
What year was this, Robby? What year and what age were you?
Oh, I was like 18, 19.
18, and what was it, late 60s?
Yeah, it was like, I'm going to say 64, 65.
Okay, so it was pretty early in the conflict then.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I'm not ready to die. I haven't even lived yet. Yeah. But I'm being shipped out to fight a war. I don't know what the heck I'm fighting, but I'm being shipped out. And I mean, that was traumatic for myself. I couldn't fathom, I'm just trying to live, and now I'm going to go ahead as a possibility. I died. So after they shipping us all out to Vietnam, the war started to de-escalate. They started dropping more bombs, but de-escalated it. I was there for probably 6 months to a year, and then they shipped me back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, in America. And from that point on, I was there to ETS and get out of the center, because you only served 2 years.
Okay. And
but to me, that was a harrowing experience. Even when I think about it, sometimes I get She is.
That's
Because you're
why I was
thinking,
asking if you're happy to talk about it, because I do remember probably the seminar that you recall seeing me at. I think it was in Birmingham, which is where I live. And
yeah,
I do believe you told the story. You were in combat in Vietnam, and your platoon got ambushed or something. Is that correct? Is that the story I remember?
there's a story behind all of that. And Darren, look, I'm blessed to be alive. Really. I really am. I'm not one of those people that escaped it. It just happened to me, and I was able to get myself in a position where I did end up dead.
Yeah.
You know, I went for years and years of what you call my therapy to coming out of all of it, because everybody else, pretty much, came out of it not in a good place. Injured, blown apart, lost a leg, limb, nutcase when you come out of that place. So I feel blessed to come out of that the way I am, seriously.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, you must really appreciate life after an experience like that.
Love life.
I can only imagine. I've never been in this kind of a situation, but you definitely lived a life, man.
In the documentary, Robby also reunites with his children that he hasn't seen in over 50 years, but no mention's made of why he pulled a Houdini and went AWOL on his family in the first place. I also wanted to hear more about what happened during his 12 years of self-imposed exile in Europe. We get some brief anecdotes about him being informally hired muscle, bodyguarding for the ladies of the night, but were there no other stories or anecdotes worth mentioning about this European stint? I know that age-related senility comes with its own rewards, but Robby's been lambasted for some of his antics over the last few years, threatening to sue people posting pics of him online or removing his social media if fans didn't give him money. To this current younger crowd, he definitely comes across as a bitter, out-of-touch old guy yelling at clouds and rehashing old war stories from an era that's long moved on. Robby seems suspended in a time and place where the sport has outgrown him, but he's never really outgrown the sport. It's a life story that kind of feels one-dimensional, a cautionary ode to unbridled selfishness, to that which at the end of the day amounts to a pointless vanity project in the context of becoming a more rounded and happier person. There's this sense of unbalanced commitment that's come at the cost of everything else along, with a life lived with festering negativity, grudges, and misplaced effort. It's a bitterness that comes across like a heavy weight carried since the early Weeder days, as always being owed something rather than taking responsibility to parlay his fame into something profitable like the other guys did. Robby seems like the kind of guy who would win the lottery, but would skip the opportunity to go pick up the check in deference to not missing a workout or meal. There's some that might see Robby as doing what he wants to do, living the dream and life on his own terms. And kudos to him for dedicating his life to the sport, I guess, even if that means not having a pot to piss in at the end of the day. He wouldn't be the first nor the last that sacrificed everything to the insatiable mistress that is bodybuilding. And while it's no good being the richest man in the graveyard, there's also little point to being the best built and ripped man at your own GoFundMe funeral neither. So if you're a die-hard fan of Robby or classic bodybuilding, you might get something out of this documentary. Robby's physique is still incredible, and his philosophy on the sport is interesting. But if you're looking for a really in-depth look at his life and career, you're going to be disappointed. It also cost me over $20 to watch in Aussie dollary dues.
$900 dues? That's a bloody outrage, it is!
So it was a bit of a kick in the nuts to what amounted to another generation-inspired, wasted opportunity. But let me know in the comments if you've seen the doc or just your thoughts on Robby in general. Thanks for watching.